Okay, so we've talked about how we came to conquer Hawaii and Alaska. Next, we're going to be looking at how, through a war against Spain, we come to control 3 new territories. The Philippines, Puerto Rico, and if we don't own Cuba, we at least are going to control Cuba after this time period. So this goes with a graphic organizer. Shoot, I don't have a copy of it. It says the Spanish-American War at the top, and it's got some boxes, and it has like Cuba and the war in Cuba, the war in the Philippines, Treaty of Paris at the bottom. It's kind of a boxes that go to a flowchart. Okay, so you're smart kids. I'm sure you can figure this out. Let's go straight to the PowerPoint, and we'll figure out why this war happened and what the effects of it are. And it's called the Spanish-American War. What's funny about it being called the Spanish-American War is that it didn't happen in Spain or in America. Those are just the 2 countries fighting, but they're not fighting in either one of their home lands. So we're going to figure out what were the causes of our involvement in the Spanish-American War and how valid they were, what individuals gained fame through their involvement in the war, what did we gain through our involvement in the war, and what did we lose. Okay. This all starts with an important territory just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and it is Cuba. Cuba was an island that was owned by Spain during this time period, and there was kind of a brutal dictatorship going on there. A Cuban named Jose Marti, who had lived in New York for a period of time and was a journalist and poet. He led a revolution in 1895 against Spanish rule. He's kind of the George Washington of Cuba. And the rebels, since they were outgunned by the Spanish government, they used guerrilla warfare, which basically means they attack by surprise and retreat. And they also destroyed some property held by Americans in Cuba. We had sugar plantations in Cuba that were owned by Americans. So American businessmen are upset about the revolution. They thought it was a threat to their land holdings and their income. Whereas other Americans were supportive. They thought that the Cubans deserved to have freedom just like we wanted from Britain in our revolution, and they were sympathetic with Jose Marti. So what we see in the Cuban Revolution is kind of the American public is kind of split in terms of whether they want it to proceed or not. Okay? So those are the long-term kind of background causes of the war. The more immediate causes of the war focus on a trend that was going on in the media during that time period. And, you know, we see criticism of our modern media in that we've kind of given our media over to bias, and we have some media outlets which have a liberal bias and some media outlets which have a conservative bias. Back then, we just simply had media that had a sensationalist bias, which means that they basically just wanted to sell newspapers. There were 2 major newspapermen in that time period, Hearst and Pulitzer, and they both wanted to sell the most newspapers, and they knew that sensationalism or kind of outrageous, exaggerated news stories seemed to sell better than just factual, boring accounts of what was going on. And this becomes known as yellow journalism. It was the result of this sales battle between William Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, and they both owned these national newspaper companies and were at odds trying to sell more papers than the other. That's why it's kind of ironic that the Pulitzer Prize for journalism or for great writing is called the Pulitzer Prize, because in the time that Joseph Pulitzer controlled a newspaper and a large segment of the media in the time period we're studying, he actually was a very, not a very ethical journalist. So it's just funny that a prize is named after him. Here's an example of kind of a modern example of yellow journalism that I want to show you. It's an ad. The newspapers try and be a little bit less obvious these days in terms of their exaggeration or bias, but this is a ad. It says, "Take a deep breath if you dare." And what it's showing you is a dust mite. They're trying to sell this duct cleaning service, and they're trying to scare you into taking action by showing this horrible creature called the dust mite. Now, the reality is you have like hundreds of these. You have like 20 in your eyebrows right now. Don't mean to disturb you. Sorry about that. Don't go, overreacting now. This is just a part of life, having dust mites in our environment, and they actually serve a purpose, and it's part of like the whole circle of life, so don't stress. But the point is that it's just trying to take something and blow it out of proportion and get a reaction, and that's exactly what this company's trying to get you to do by buying their duct cleaning service. And this is exactly what Hearst and Pulitzer were trying to do, is kind of drum up business, just blow things out of proportion and scare people and get them to buy the next edition of the paper. They were selling them at multiple times during the day, a morning edition, an evening edition, so they're really trying to string people along and get them to buy. by their paper. This is a famous quote by William Hearst. It said, "You furnish the pictures, I'll provide the war." The idea was that a war would really sell a lot of newspapers, and so Hearst really wanted a war to cover, and he's going to get that opportunity by printing a lot of pictures from Cuba and kind of exaggerating claims and drawing things out of proportion so that he can in fact bring about a war that will make profit for him. Okay. One example is, say, this political cartoon here. It's called Spaniards Search Women on American Steamers. If you look closely, what you see here is a naked woman surrounded by suited men, supposedly Spaniards, who are searching her. Now, perhaps American women were searched on American steamers. Perhaps the Spanish did do some kind of search, but I guarantee you they did not do a strip search of American women on these steamers. So maybe they searched their purses, or maybe they searched their room. I don't know what the specifics are here, but I guarantee you they were not strip searched. And so this is an example where they took a small idea about searches and then blew it up to unbelievable proportions. Another thing that made us angry at the Spanish and want to go to war with them is something called the Delome letter. This is Spanish Minister Delome. He served the Spanish here in America and was supposed to be the main diplomat between us. He wrote a personal letter to a friend in which he insulted our president, William McKinley, and that letter was leaked to the American press, and the press is all too happy to print it over and over and talk about how outlandish it is that he has insulted our president. I actually looked up the letter just to see what horrible, horrific things he said about our president, and he said basically this in in red here. It says, it shows once more what McKinley is, weak and catering to the rabble, and besides a low politician. So then there's the fighting words that McKinley used against, Delome used against our President McKinley. What's funnier is McKinley's own vice president, Teddy Roosevelt, at one point had said that McKinley had the backbone of a chocolate eclair, which is a pastry, which obviously has no bones in it. So it's kind of one of those things where you can talk bad about your mama, but nobody else better talk bad about your mama. Where our own vice president could speak badly about the president, but if a Spanish minister said something the least bit critical, then that was a grounds in which to consider some kind of retribution against Spain for that. So that's a second short-term cause. And then we had the explosion of one of our ships off of the coast of Cuba. The Maine had been sent to Cuba to protect American interests off the coast of Cuba. And there was a mysterious explosion that killed 250 American sailors. And immediately you can see here that the press blames Spain. It says crisis is at hand, Spanish treachery. There's this assumption that the Spanish are just responsible for this killing of 250 American sailors. We find out later, and many years later, that they did a study, and actually there was an explosion in the engine room. And so this actually was not the handiwork of the Spanish, and if this was a reason why we went to war, it was misguided. But by that point, it was too late. We'd already engaged in this war with the Spanish. So an example, not the only example, I'm afraid, of America going to war on kind of false pretenses. War in the Philippines then begins, as well as war in Cuba. So there's two fronts on which this war is fought. In the Philippines, there had already been a revolt against Spanish rule, and so we were basically just joining them in an effort to cast off the Spanish. We sent our U.S. fleet towards the Philippines, and Commodore George Dewey destroys the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay. Manila was the major harbor there in the Philippines. And so we quite handily win in the Philippines. And then Spanish troops are going to surrender to us, not to the Filipinos. And what the Filipinos, like Emilio Aguinaldo, for example, is one of the leaders of the Philippines resistance. He's kind of the George Washington of the Philippines. They all assume that we are helping free them from Spanish rule, and then we're going to turn over rule of the Philippines to the Filipinos and let them have self-rule. But that's not actually what happens. Instead, we become the rulers of the Philippines, and the Filipinos are going to be very upset about this. They're going to feel like we kind of stabbed them in the back, and they're going to fight a multi-year war against our rule. So it's kind of the first Vietnam in a way. It's jungle terrain. It's going to be a very treacherous and long and expensive war to force the Filipinos to actually accept our rule after this time period. And then we have the war in the Caribbean. This is, of course, Cuba, which is just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. There, we blockade Havana, up here, which is the main port in Cuba. And the Rough Riders are going to fight under the leadership of Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy and actually ordered the opening of fire on in the Philippines. But then he becomes quite bored with his desk job in the Navy and leaves it to lead and command a cavalry unit called the Rough Riders in Cuba, and gets a lot of fame for that. They win at Kettle Hill, which is really the strategic importance, but then later a more highly publicized victory at San Juan Hill, which wasn't actually as important strategically, but was simply covered by the media, and so therefore was drummed up as the key battle. They win that battle of San Juan Hill, and so once we win the land and then we destroy the Navy off the coast of Cuba, we have basically won the war in the Caribbean. So, it should also be added that in the Spanish-American War, we had an all-volunteer force. There was no draft. We also really weren't that well prepared for the war in terms of we didn't have really enough uniforms. People were fighting in tropical climates wearing wool uniforms. Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders was supposed to be a cavalry unit, but they didn't even have horses, actually. So any paintings thereof in which you see the Battle of San Juan Hill, in which they're majestically outfitted and riding horses, that's all poppycock. They didn't even have them. So despite the fact that we weren't that well prepared, we did defeat the Spanish, and from that we're going to get the Treaty of Paris. The treaty in 1898 does some very important things. The first of all, we get Cuba their independence. I put that in quotations because while they're technically independent, we're actually going to control them economically and politically. And so that's what we call a protectorate. Basically, they become a puppet state of the United States until the Cuban Revolution led by Fidel Castro in the 1950s. We get outright Puerto Rico and Guam from Spain, so we basically beat them up and took their lunch money, and we'll now have colonies in the Pacific. In addition to Hawaii, we'll now control Guam, and in Puerto Rico will be an important naval base for us also. And then we're going to buy the Philippines from Spain for $20 million, since we didn't actually have a lot of people on the ground there to militarily control and consolidate our hold of the Philippines. And we're going to buy it for $20 million, but then we're going to have to spend a lot more money than that to fight a war forcing the Filipinos to accept our rule. So hopefully now you know the long-term and the short-term causes of our involvement in the Spanish-American War. You know that Teddy Roosevelt gained fame through the Battle of San Juan Hill and his leadership of the Rough Riders. And we gained some colonies that we had not had before, Puerto Rico, Guam, and control of Cuba at some level. The question that really hopefully is a little less clear to you is, what did we lose? And some people say that what we lost was kind of the moral high ground. That before this time period we could have claimed that we were the force for democracy. I mean, Hawaii happened, but and it had its suspicions that it wasn't necessarily the Hawaiians who really sought for us to take over Hawaii, but now we've really drummed up a war on false pretenses, which is we find out that we went to war for no reason because the Maine was not attacked by the Spanish. And then we've stabbed the Filipinos in the back by taking over their country against their will. So whatever moral high ground we claimed before this time period, some would say it's pretty well compromised after the Spanish-American War, but I'll leave that up to you. It's just kind of a point of a turning point, really, in terms of Americans pursuing their self-interests. Some would say ruthlessly, to make sure that we achieve our foreign policy objectives worldwide. So that's it. See you in class.